towards their villages and homes. So the story of the pandemic, our knowledge of the pandemic, would remain incomplete in India, for instance, if we do not record, archive, and engage with the experiences of these millions, 1.5 million at a conservative estimate, who walked on the highways of India last year, this time, to go back to their villages when the lockdown was announced. Much of the knowledge created about the pandemic, for instance, is based on the abstract category of the citizen, which actually occludes the misery of the poor and the marginalized, because not all citizens are similarly placed, as I said just now. It doesn't take into account the experiences of the under or the unemployed persons, the persons with disabilities, the itinerant, the migratory, and the stateless people. There are many elisions and omissions that mark most mainstream accounts of the pandemic and the measures to cope with it. The knowledge that is being created about the pandemic determines to a very great extent our responses to it. So therefore, epistemology is a very important question for us as teachers and scholars and researchers. It's not just about creating knowledge. That knowledge becomes the base for the kind of response that governments and states are adopting to cope with the pandemic, to deal with the pandemic. The approach used to create knowledge influences the responses to it. We might have had a different and more inclusive response to the challenges posed by the pandemic had we created a different kind of knowledge about it. I don't know. I'm just this is in the realm of speculation, really. For instance, one of the measures to delay the transmission of the virus has been the lockdown that requires people to shelter in. This measure has, however, in countries like ours, created untold misery and suffering for the poor, and world over, and this is not just in India, the world over, it has resulted in exponential spike in cases of violence against women. Now, from the earlier experiences of the pandemic and similar lockdowns in West Africa, the experience of the Ebola and the Zika outbreaks, it was well known that when there are pandemics of this nature, one of the consequences is an exponential increase in violence against women. However, we chose to disregard this knowledge while framing the current set of measures for the lockdown, thus rendering thousands of women vulnerable within their homes that were supposed to be safe. I'm sure all of us remember the famous slogan last year, stay home, stay safe. So the very place that was supposed to be safe turns out to be the unsafest place from the data and statistics that is now coming out. The question at the heart of this discussion is, what is considered knowledge? Who has it? How is it acquired and transmitted? How does new knowledge get acceptance? Can humanities and social sciences lay claim to knowledge as much as engineering, technology, and the sciences can? Do the performing arts and cinema, photography, design, and similar expressions qualify to be described as knowledge systems? Can knowledge be produced collectively? Is it produced only in some specific location through certain standardized methods? These and similar questions are central to the critical debates around the questions of epistemology today. Often, we take the answers to these questions as self-evident truths. However, increasingly, the project to destabilize these so-called truths has gained momentum across universities and departments. And it is heartening to note that the Department of Philosophy of the University of Delhi is interested in these questions. So there's lots to say about feminist epistemology, and obviously it's not possible for me to cover everything in 1 hour. So I'll just raise some important facets, some important debates, and we'll try and engage with those. So today I have been asked to discuss feminist epistemology. And feminist epistemology refers to the insights and knowledge that has emerged out of feminist political engagement and consciousness raising. Feminist knowledge projects take great care to ensure that the voices, ideas, perspectives, and theories produced by those engaged in feminist struggles are acknowledged, rendered visible, and not overwritten with accounts of professionalized or academic writing. So, feminist epistemology, feminist knowledge is acutely aware and conscious that it emerges out of, that it has a direct connection with, and that it is based on feminist action, feminist activism, feminist mobilizational efforts. So the two are actually linked with one another. So they're not really separate in that sense. Feminist epistemology, by virtue of its close connect with the movements and campaigns, is committed to the view that knowledge is produced collectively, collaboratively, and in a cooperative framework. It sees knowledge as co-produced and dialogic in nature, not finite and singular. Typically, feminist knowledge production exults in acknowledging the linkages with the movement. It's very happy to admit and acknowledge and accept the influences, the inputs, not only from other scholars, other activists, but from the ground. So there is a clear appreciation, acknowledgement, and celebration of this link. Feminist epistemologists also stress the socially interactive nature of knowers. So all of us are knowers, but we are socially interactive. Of course, in the digital age, all of this has to have a different kind of conversation now. But even so, we realize that we are socially created, each of us. So the way we interact with each other, even as knowers, even as people who are pursuing knowledge, it will be intersected by, and it will be determined by our specific social locations. So they argue that epistemically, human beings are deeply dependent on one another. And I think that's a very important facet of feminist epistemology, the idea that human beings are dependent. And here dependent is not used in a negative or pejorative sense, not in the sense that it takes away the autonomy of the individual, but on the other hand, to say that it is co-produced, knowledge is co-produced. So, some amount of, there's lots that I could say about the background to feminist epistemology, but yet a short sketch I think is in order. The gender question in epistemology arises with respect to how women know and are known. How do women get knowledge? This was one question. Can they get knowledge? How are they known? How does knowledge, or how do knowledge systems represent them? These were some of the earliest questions that the early feminists asked. Who claims to know them and why? What conception of knowing the subject informs and inflects the operative conception of knowledge through which claims by and about women are adjudicated? How is knowledge situated formally, morally, politically about women? So who produces the knowledge about women? Can women produce knowledge about themselves? Why is the knowledge about women produced in certain ways? These became certain important questions from where this entire debate actually gathers steam and takes off. Women and knowledge are often subject of crude jokes and memes. I'm sure all of you have come across such things, and it makes us uncomfortable. I'm sure you've heard of that, popular book with the title that says "Women Are from Venus." Yeah, so basically to say that they are a puzzle wrapped in an enigma, which is a mystery. So basically saying nobody knows what women are thinking, nobody knows what women are, how their mind works, or what is it that they know. So they remain a puzzle, or that women cannot ever be understood because, and that's very dangerous, because they do not often mean what they say. I'm sure you've heard of this. So these become the troubling set of contexts. And there's much more that I could add to this, but this is just a glimpse, which becomes the takeoff point for a stronger, deeper discussion about women and knowledge systems. Underlying this is the assumption that women do not possess rationality, since women supposedly inhabit a world that's framed by their bodies. They are sort of imprisoned by their bodies. Whereas men supposedly are freed from their bodies. They are not regulated by hormones. So they are able to live a life of the mind and thus produce knowledge that is relevant and meaningful and universal and eternal and dynamic. All the good things, yeah? Women, on the other hand, it is assumed, are impossibly entangled with their bodies and their hormones across time and space. Their lives are characterized by reproductive and care functions that are in the realm of nature. So women do it, birds and animals do it. So it's basically just a natural activity that women are always engaged in. Women's lives consist, therefore, of repetitive activities such as cooking, cleaning. You finish cooking and cleaning, what do you have to do next? You have to cook and clean again, right? So it's repetitive. So this repetitive cyclical nature or care activities, you feed the baby, bathe the baby, clean the baby, put the baby to sleep, only to find that the baby is dirty. So you pick the baby up, clean the baby again, feed the baby. So it's cyclical in nature, it's repetitive in nature. And of course, women's bodies are also determined by the cyclical flow of hormones. So this repetitive nature of both their bodies and the functions that they perform really, prevent them from producing the kind of knowledge that men can, and because they are basically engaged in unvarying activities. There's no change in the kind of work that they do. Cooking, washing, dusting, caring. How can they produce creative and dynamic knowledge? So they remain childlike, intuitive, spontaneous, tempestuous, prone to mood swings. These are the qualities dismissively associated with women's thinking. What kind of knowledge can such beings produce? What kind of knowledge? So in Hindi, I don't know if everybody here knows Hindi, but usually we hear people say dadi ma ke nuske or gharelu nuske, or in English you hear the word old wives' tales. Irrational, but sweet and charming, but it's not knowledge really. It's like some superstition, some mumbo jumbo, and you sort of indulge in what Dadi is saying, but it's not really knowledge. These are all phrases that contain within them a clear degree of infantilization and condescension of women's lives and experiences and the knowledge generated from these experiences. Whereas men inhabit the domain of culture. Men are cultured because they have a mind that can be cultivated. And this mind is free from repetitive chores and cyclical body rhythms, thus enabling them to think rationally, and therefore they are capable of producing knowledge that's creative, innovative, dynamic. It's here that feminist politics steps in to call out the unequal nature of the division of labor in most societies that creates a situation where men have leisure to think and produce knowledge and women do not have access to that leisure. In the realm of academic knowledge production, original single authorship is valued. All of you are, I'm sure, in the throes of having to make your CV, calculating your API points. So I'm sure you know that single-authored book gets more points than an edited volume. If you write a chapter in an edited volume, it doesn't get the same points as you would get, so on and so forth. So the kind of obsession with individual knowledge production is something that feminist epistemology is extremely uncomfortable with, because it inadvertently contributes to a tendency and it fails to acknowledge the intellectual contribution of others, of activism. It does not recognize the lineage of ideas and theories that have been forged outside of the academy, often incrementally, collectively, and informally. That said, I don't want to set up a binary between various epistemologies of knowledge, academic versus activist, etc., etc. But I think what feminist epistemology is trying to do is to try and create a kind of continuum. I think that is what feminist epistemology is interested in doing. Since most of you here are from the university systems and various departments, I think it would be interesting for those who don't know to look at this book by Sandra Harding, which really is very, very central to any discussion on feminist epistemology. It's a book published now it's quite an old book, 1986, but it remains, the concerns it raises remain very relevant even today. The Science Question in Feminism, that's the title of the book. It examined various epistemological positions within feminist approaches to knowledge. So it's not as though there is one singular feminist approach to epistemology. Even within feminist discussions, there are various emphasis and accents that are there, various orientations that are there, and there's a lot of overlap. However, broadly, she classified it into three. This doesn't mean that they are exclusive or final, because knowledge keeps flowing and is dynamic. So the broad categories that she identified were feminist empiricism, feminist standpoint theory, and feminist postmodernism. Having said that, please do not think of these as watertight categories that are not talking to each other, because that's really against feminist epistemology, to not talk to each other, to not have a conversation or dialogue with each other. That's not feminist epistemology at all. But broadly, just for the sake of our convenience, we can divide it into these three categories. I shall offer a brief snapshot style description of these facets for those who might be interested. So feminist empiricism, actually, it challenges the uncritical focus on men and advocates adding women. So it says, basically, it's saying that, look, knowledge systems are okay, but the only problem is that women are not here, so we need to add women. I'm sure some of you have already sensed the discomfort with this position is that, just adding women, of course, that's important. To bring in women is important, but that's not enough, because you're not really engaging with some of the fundamental assumptions that are underlying this kind of knowledge production. Feminist standpoint is something that I'll talk about in slightly greater detail, so I won't talk about it here. Feminist postmodernism, of course, is skeptical, as you know very well, as philosophy, researchers and scholars here. You would know that it is skeptical of universal claims of reason and progress of science, and argues that only political solidarities across social locations can ground feminist findings. That means there can't be one singular feminist epistemology. There are feminisms and there will be epistemologies. And we'll talk about this as well, not in great detail, not possible to cover everything, but I'm sure we'll have an occasion to refer to this. There's a lot of conversation that's going on between these positions. So please don't think of these as watertight positions. Of the many ideas that are contained within feminist epistemology, I would like to begin by examining the idea of the situated knower. I think, the situatedness of knowledge, actually, that really is, to my mind, it is one of the very powerful and attractive ideas that feminist epistemology has to offer. Ritu, somebody's raised a hand. Do I have to, is that a question? Can I answer the questions later?
No, ma'am, you go ahead. We'll take the questions at the end of the session.
Yeah, I prefer that, please. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the situated nature of knowledge and the situated nature of the knower, of the person who's trying to gain that knowledge. So feminist accounts of epistemology is actually if you start plotting it, it's a history of departures from conventional ideas on epistemology. Conventionally, epistemology believes that knowledge is a priori. It's like a normative. It's a production of normative principles, normative values, normative systems of understanding the world. Feminist epistemology moves away from this. Second, conventionally, it is understood that knowledge should be objective. And it should be apolitical. It must not side with any position. Feminist epistemology moves away from this assumption. Another assumption that conventional epistemology, at least in social sciences, talks about is that it should be impersonal, sort of objective. They are connected with each other. Feminist epistemology, I'm sure all of you have heard of the slogan, the personal is political. So there is really no way that feminist epistemology can remain impersonal. A lot of the personal will necessarily be part of the knowledge. Who are you? Who am I? Who's talking about it? What is my personal location? What is my history? The person who's writing this book, who is she? I don't necessarily have to erase myself from the knowledge that I am producing. I must, in fact, write myself into the knowledge that I am producing, because that is really the honest way of reflecting upon my own circumstances and helping the reader or the student know more about the producer of the knowledge. It is really a sleight of hand to pretend that there is no sort of tangible producer of knowledge. I'll come to that in just a little while. And that personal experiences have no place when recording knowledge. Feminist epistemology moves away from these ideas, many others, but I've just mentioned a couple. Feminist epistemologists argue that people may understand the same object in different ways. And that depends upon the distinct relationship in which they stand to it. It depends upon where you are located, the way you look at things, the way you look at social developments, the way you look at the world around you, at the relationships between people. All of this is contingent upon and constructed by, to a very great extent, to the distinctive social location that you are in, that the knower is located in. One of the major contributions of feminist epistemology has been the thorough critique of the individualism of modern epistemology and the corresponding reconstruction of epistemic subjects as situated knowers. That it's not as though there is an autonomous, pure individual who has no ascriptive identities. He or she or they are simply individuals with no caste, class, color, race, ethnic identity, none of that, just an individual knower. Feminist epistemology is uncomfortable with such an imagination. In fact, feminist epistemology would like to place the knower in a complex set of social relationships and acknowledge that it is from this position that this knowledge is being created or that this knowledge is being produced. So from the Cartesian beginnings, which all of you are very familiar with, of modern epistemology, where knowledge was thought to be the result of careful exercise of an individual's mental faculties, to the dominant contemporary epistemological framework wherein epistemic subjects are interchangeable. So it doesn't matter who is knowing. There is knowledge. A could know it, or B could know it, or X could know it. It doesn't matter. Knowledge remains knowledge. It remains something which is unchanging. Only the knower changes, and it really doesn't matter who the knower is. Knower is interchangeable. Feminist epistemologists have drawn attention to the inadequacies of this abstract category of the individual. Very uncomfortable, and I'll just show you why it is so. Feminists have criticized the claim that knowers are abstract, isolated individuals. On the contrary, they focus upon and they emphasize on the collaborative nature of knowledge production. And this is something that's highlighted by feminist epistemology. All of us depend on each other for specific and specialized forms of knowledge. Not only is the layperson dependent on the expert, and this expertise differs. So today I might be the expert, but tomorrow there might be a subject on which you are the expert. So I'm dependent on you. If you need the tap in your house to be fixed, you need to depend on the expertise of the plumber. If the plumber needs to know something about how to get admission to the university, you become the expert. So there are no permanent, fixed, universal experts who have access to certain esoteric sets of ideas that can be described as knowledge. Everybody has knowledge, everybody has expertise in different facets of life, and we as human beings in a society need to share that. So this is the idea that feminist epistemology is trying to advocate. So not only is the layperson dependent on the expert, and we can be both layperson at sometimes and sometimes experts, but even within epistemic communities. So let us say the community of philosophers in the department, even there, supposing there's a research team, there are cognitive divisions of labor. Somebody specializes in social philosophy, somebody else specializes in political philosophy. So there is this kind of division of cognitive labor. And this results in dependence on each other's expertise for knowledge that's relevant to one's own research. So for me to do my research, for me to write my paper, I need the knowledge that is produced by others. So in such a milieu, how can I claim that knowledge is the result of my own individual pursuit? It is very clearly a group activity, a shared activity, an activity based on exchange of ideas, information, and knowledge. Feminist epistemologists, however, so I hope this bit is clear, and then they go on to argue that we need to be mindful of the power dynamics within these activities, and that's what makes this argument complete. So yes, it's co-produced. Yes, we need to have cooperation. Yes, there is knowledge, and we are dependent on each other. However, it's not this cheerful dependence where everybody is dependent on the other in the same way with no consequences or the same set of consequences. The fact is that there is a power dynamics within this exchange of knowledge. And this is something that feminist epistemology is trying to alert us to. There is a power dynamics which examines the correlations between structures of cognitive and social authority. Those who are socially superior, those who are socially privileged, those who are socially in a powerful position have cognitive power, cognitive influence, and the ability to project their knowledge and their understanding as the normative standards of knowledge in any given society. And feminism's responsibility, or feminist epistemology's project, really is to uncover these power dynamics. That really completes the story here. The story, talking about stories, I'm sure all of you have heard of how the Nobel Prize, for instance, slipped this very well-known scientist, chemistry specialist called Rosalind Franklin, who, despite her path-breaking work in the field, did not get acknowledged, and it was the trio of Crick, Wilkins, and Watson who later came to get the Nobel Prize for their path-breaking work on the double helix structure of the DNA. So Rosalind Franklin actually was some of the photographs that she was able to take in her lab, especially photograph number 51. This was crucial to the discovery that Crick and Watson later made about the double helix nature of the DNA. However, the Nobel went to them, and her efforts were not acknowledged and not recorded. It's only now that we begin to hear of Rosalind Franklin's work, thanks to feminist historians of science. So this was a classic instance of social authority that men have, which mapped onto cognitive authority, a situation wherein women's contribution to knowledge is either ignored, unnoticed, or dismissed and disregarded. That's really what happened with Rosalind Franklin. In addition to this, feminist epistemologists have expressed discomfort with the way in which individual knowers are themselves conceptualized as generic, knowers, interchangeable, as I said earlier, in the act of knowing. Feminists argue that each knower is situated in a specific location and hence brings to the activity of knowledge and knowledge production their own specific set of experiences. Those of us who are teachers here and we've taught in classrooms that are heterogeneous, we would remember very well how students are differently located. So while you might be using the same lecture, you might be using the same study material, the same study resources, and they are attending the same lecture, but each of the student, because of their specific social location, brings to the classroom and brings to the lecture different qualities and makes different sense of the same of what you are saying. So it's not as though all of them are making the same sense of it, because they are bringing their own specific experience from their social location. And it is the task of a feminist teacher to actually draw out those distinctive social locations and social experiences into the classroom discussion in order to co-produce a new kind of knowledge about whatever it is that you are trying to discuss in class. Having said that, to give an obvious example, sex-specific bodily experiences, such as knowing pain during childbirth, for example, cannot be accessed by members of other sexes. Feminists argue that there is a vast range of experiences differentiating along the lines of social location. So bodily, I just gave you an example, social locations as well. For instance, in a city like Delhi, the city of Delhi is experienced by women, men, others very differently. The question of safety, access to public washrooms, ability to use public parks or roadside eateries, traveling by public transport, these are all very differently marked experiences for the genders, men, women, and other genders. The difference in knowers that feminists attend to are not random or idiosyncratic. It's not as though, oh, she likes pink, but she likes dark pink kind of a situation. But these differences come out of socially structured and systematic structures of difference. They are socially created and they're systemically created. It's not some random like or dislike, or I experienced it this way and I did not experience it like that. It's not random and arbitrary. According to these arguments, one's perspective shapes and sets the limits of how we can know. That's very important. Our social location determines the limits of what we can know and how we know it. It has a huge influence. Therefore, to have these kind of anonymous, uniform ways of testing students is something that we might want to actually discuss and think about, because each student really is bringing a unique and specific set of social experiences to the table. As a corollary, institutions of knowledge production like universities are dominated by, if we look around and if we are honest about our universities, we are dominated by a particular kind of group and groups, not one group necessarily, but a set of groups. And their perspective on what is knowledge, their perspective on what is worthwhile to know, how it should be known, this then acquires the status of being true knowledge, because universities are in the business of certifying, systematizing, and sort of accrediting and saying that, yes, indeed, this is knowledge. But it's not some, it's not some already existing self-evident truth. It is a group of people or groups of people who have distinctive social locations, who are coming together with their own social experiences, who produce this knowledge and lend to this knowledge credibility and legitimacy. For example, many who argue that underrepresentation of women in science is a concern. There's a lot of discussion today about women in STEM. And they believe that this is, of course, a problem because this indicates that women are not being given equal opportunities to be a part of science. But there's another reason for why this is being talked about. And that reason is that women in science, the absence of women in science is a cause for worry also because the way science is shaped, the way scientific knowledge is shaped, scientific discoveries will be shaped and scientific experiments conducted, it will reflect only one particular or some particular dominant groups and their sensibilities and perspectives. Therefore, underrepresentation of women in science is not only a justice issue, but it is also an epistemic issue. The STEM scientists, STEM feminist scientists are saying that the nature of scientific discourse itself, the nature of scientific experiments, scientific knowledge itself would benefit if diverse kinds of people, and it doesn't mean only women here, if diverse kinds of groups of people are able to come to the scientific table, come to the laboratories and try and start bringing their own perspectives into creating experiments, producing knowledge, thinking about things, because right now you have a particular kind of profile of the knower who is creating and producing this knowledge. Feminist epistemology focuses on how the social location of the knower affects what and how she or he or they know. Individual social locations consist of their ascribed identity, gender, race, ability, caste, class, sexual orientation, and so on. These subjective identities are incorporated into the self-understanding of people, how I understand myself. And this in turn influences my ability to know and create knowledge confidently. If I have a self-identity which makes me feel ashamed, which makes me feel abject, which makes me feel diffident and tentative, then my confidence to produce knowledge and to produce knowledge with conviction will be adversely affected, is what feminist epistemologists are trying to argue. Orthodox epistemology presupposes a standardized knower who is everyone and no one in particular. Donna Haraway, very interestingly, calls this the God trick of seeing everything from nowhere in particular. And yet, strangely, the knowledge that this knower produces bears close resemblance to the values of the dominant groups in society and benefits the interests of these groups, unknowingly perhaps. This results in an uneven distribution of authority, expertise, power, and privilege in society. The implication is that if the knower cannot see from nowhere, from an observation position that could be anywhere and everywhere, then the knowledge that they produce cannot be reliable knowledge. Reliable knowledge can only be produced if you're producing it from nowhere in particular and from everywhere. This results in what feminist epistemologists describe as epistemic oppression. And how? I'll just talk about it. Epistemic norms that uphold the social, economic, and political privileges of some are then upheld and imposed upon those whom it oppresses. This perpetuates norms that treat those with powers as credible transmitters of objective knowledge. So those who have social authority also have cognitive authority, and what they communicate, what they say has credibility because they produce objective knowledge and truth. Everybody else who is marked, who has a specific identity, such people can only talk about their experiences. These are only opinions, not facts. So this is that classic distinction that many of you are familiar with, fact versus opinion or fact versus values. All other knowledge production is suspect because they are producing subjective experiences or politicized opinions. They support broadly shared distinctions between fact and opinion, as I said, and dismiss resistance as biased opinion. So if you question this, then you are biased. When it challenges the idea, if you challenge this idea, then you are biased. Thus, a woman's observation can easily be disregarded as a subjective experience, or a Dalit student's observation can be easily dismissed as political opinion, as opposed to the objective knowledge and truth that flows from those who have epistemic privilege of being the credible transmitters of knowledge. Now I'll talk a little bit about experience and embodiment. People experience the world by using their bodies, which have different constitutions and are differently located in space and time. Disability studies challenges the normativization of knowledge that is based on the so-called able-bodied. The normativization of what the disability studies scholar Anita Ghait describes as the temporarily able-bodied. Yes, ability is temporary. Sooner than later, all of us are disabled in one way or the other. We use glasses, hearing aids, walking stick, wheelchair, so on. The knowledge that is, however, produced is the knowledge that reinforces the perfect, within quotes, normative human body, thus producing in its arrogance the disabled body. So what she has argued is that there is no already existing disabled body. It is a certain kind of epistemology that results in the production of the disabled body. Dominant epistemological frames assume an embodiment that is perfect and able. Feminist epistemology has questioned a range of knowledge domains such as public planning, health, economy, and so on, wherein the normative person who creates the knowledge and to whom the knowledge caters to is the able-bodied male. For instance, if we take up the ubiquitous issue of public washrooms, at least in Delhi, studies have found that women have fewer washrooms than men. Washrooms for persons with disabilities is even more difficult to locate. Wash basins, pots, taps, garbage disposal, lighting, design, everything caters to the standard able-bodied male user. This apparently inconsequential fact has serious implications for scores of women and persons with disabilities in determining their life choices with regard to education, with regard to livelihood, and with regard to travel. For long, feminist critics of modern medical practices, for instance, have pointed to the resistance that medical sciences have to deviating from the so-called normal, meaning male-derived, medical model in studying women's symptoms as they experience and report them. It exposes the conviction that any special interest group, you remember I just spoke about the Dalit student, women, etc., any special interest group cannot be objective. Their experiences and circumstances cannot yield knowledge. Each of us individuals, we do have first-hand and personal access to our own bodily and mental states and knowledge about ourselves, which differs from an expert's knowledge about ourselves. The movement in feminist epistemology has been away from the dependence on the expert to experiential knowledge. Women's experiences with doctors and therapists is a case in point. Where women's complaints of pain, for instance, there's a lot of feminist study on this facet of pain in the context of feminist epistemology. It's often dismissed as fiction or a vague condition, which was often referred to as, that horrible word, hysteria, which itself has a complicated history in modern psychology and psychiatry, or nervous depression. It was believed that hysteria could be set off by a plethora of bad habits, which included reading novels, which caused erotic fantasies. So if you read novels, you were prone to hysteria, and other similar deviant tendencies resulting in any number of symptoms. So it's because you read that you had seductive behavior, irrationality, and you became a general troublemaker. You were just a troublemaker if you read too much. A number of 19th century practitioners gained fame as hysteria doctors. They specialized in this. The belief was that the uterus is the root cause of all this. It's a troublemaker par excellence. It was best sated when pregnant. The triad of marriage, sexual intercourse, and pregnancy, this was considered to be the ultimate treatment for the semen-hungry womb. It's no accident that such a diagnosis took off just as when women were fighting to gain access to universities and professions in US and Europe. A decrease in marriage and falling birth rates coincided with this medical diagnosis that criticized the new woman and her focus on intellectual, artistic, or activist pursuits instead of motherhood. A prominent psychiatrist in Philadelphia, Sir S. Mitchell, championed what he called the rest cure. Sick women were put to bed, ordered not to move a muscle, and instructed to eschew all intellectual and creative work of any kind, because that's the root cause of all the problems that women have. They were fed 4 ounces of milk every 2 hours, and they were not even permitted to visit the washroom in many cases. Disturbingly, scores of women, and this is in the US that I'm talking about, women artists and writers were diagnosed as hysterics in a period when rebelliousness, shamelessness within quotes, ambition, and overeducation were considered to be the likely causes for all of this. It was suggested that too much energy was going into the brain instead of staying in the reproductive organs of the women. And this is why women were behaving strangely. Transgressing prescribed roles would make women sick. British suffragettes, for instance, were actually treated within quotes as hysterics in prison. Outspoken proponents for women's rights were often characterized as the shrieking sisterhood. In our context, in India, we hear of women being declared as mad or Diane, witch, for instance, when they begin to assert themselves and claim property and land which is rightfully theirs. Such women are again forcibly treated or forcibly institutionalized. Some of you would have read of this exceptional work of fiction called Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, where you find that she is complaining about her husband, who is a doctor actually, and thus an expert. And he belittles her experience of, loneliness, a kind of postpartum depression that she was going through. And she was, the cure that was prescribed was a kind of a rest cure that I spoke about. She was not allowed to, she was actually asked to relieve her mind, so that she was not allowed to read or write or think. She just had to lie in bed. And this actually made her depression worse. And you must read the book. I don't want to spoil it for you. I'm sure you'd make a good connection when you read it now. Nancy Hartsock's 1983 articulation of standpoint theory is very significant for us here when we talk about feminist epistemology. She argues that women's contribution to subsistence, that means, daily maintenance and care work that women do, and to child rearing, this results in a systematic difference of experience across genders. What she's saying is that the kind of work that women do routinely, systematically, and every day, that gives to them a different kind of experience about life, about relationships, and about social structures. accordingly the activities of women that place them in a socially underprivileged position. So because they are only doing this kind of work and they're not really, theoretically, they're not working and they're not earning, if at all they're doing it only in addition. Their primary role and responsibility remains care, cooking, cleaning, looking after, etc., childbirth, child rearing. So this puts them in a socially underprivileged position. But despite that, she says that this becomes the basis for a privileged epistemic standpoint. And why does it become a privileged epistemic standpoint? Because they are able to gain a perspective through which a deeper understanding of patriarchal institutions and ideologies can be reached. And how this happens, or how this could happen, it needn't happen in every case, but how it could happen and result in a feminist standpoint is that you're able to see your life and you're able to see the systematic marginalization that you experience despite the role that you are playing in child rearing, bearing, maintenance work, subsistence, cooking, cleaning, bodily care functions. Despite that, you're underprivileged and your powerlessness is very evident to you, but you're also able to see that due to the work that you are doing, there are others in society who are able to lead a life of pleasure, privilege, and leisure. Once you're able to make this connection, you acquire a feminist standpoint. It's something that this becomes the epistemic privilege that women could acquire. In fact, this is an idea that has a very long lineage. It comes from Marxism. It comes from the work of the Polish Marxist Lukács, and it has a history here. I'm not going to talk about that right now. Some of you might have watched the celebrated Malayalam film on one of the streaming services called The Great Indian Kitchen. If you've not, I recommend that please do watch it for questions of feminist epistemology. You would, those of you who watched it, you would recall that the film shows the daily grind of domesticity that the female protagonist engages in. And, it's very remarkable. She's nameless. She doesn't have a name in the film. In that sense, she's a stand-in for thousands of women across time and space. So the daily grind of domesticity, as seen through the eyes of the woman protagonist, not only does it tell us about her life, the film then shows us, as a result of this daily grind, what is the kind of life that the men in the household are able to lead. For example, her father-in-law, who just has to sit and the toothbrush with toothpaste on it is handed over to him so that he can brush his teeth. So this connection between the grind that she engages in and the life of leisure and comfort and privilege that the men in her family can, once and if you're able to make this connection, that becomes what feminists have described as the standpoint theory, or standpoint in various, it's differently articulated in different accounts. For most feminist standpoint theorists, a standpoint is understood as an achieved stance. It's not just a perspective. It's an achieved stance. It is achieved when you are able to see and make that crucial connection. Once you make that link, you have achieved that standpoint. This achievement of an epistemologically privileged, and here privilege means a standpoint from where you can actually see everything. You're able to see the connections. Privileged in that sense, involves a political engagement that makes clear to the socially underprivileged the shared nature of their experience. And that's really important, because what it does is, when you have achieved this epistemic position or this standpoint, you're able to see that it's not just a random, arbitrary fate that you are subjected to in your household. but rather this is the fate that many others like you elsewhere are also experiencing. And thus, it becomes revelatory of the systematic structure of power relationships. And that really is feminist epistemology. When you're able to achieve this status and you're able to make that connection and you're able to establish this as a systematic arrangement of social relationships of power, power relations, that really is the key. So the two very important ideas here shared. So when it is shared, when you realize that it's not just I who's going through this, but there are many others like me, then there is the possibility of feminist political action. There is the possibility of activism then. Because if you think you are the only one, then you despair and you think, okay, maybe I just have to go through my life like this. But once you begin to understand that there are many others like you, then there is the possibility of actually coming together and doing something. And when you begin to realize that this is systemic, that it is organized, it's not just random, and it's not just the personal quirk of the father-in-law in that film where, you know, he sits with the brush waiting for the toothpaste to be put on it. It really becomes, you begin to have a different kind of knowledge, and you begin to have a different kind of perspective on your own ability to engage with the world around you. Feminist standpoint theories have developed substantially over the years, and one of the ideas that has really broadened the scope of feminist standpoint theories is, of course, Patricia Hill Collins's really powerful idea of intersectionality, which I'm not talking about right now. But this has resulted in what we call today the Black feminist standpoint or the Dalit feminist standpoint. Maybe when we have a discussion, we can speak a little bit more about these things. Feminist epistemology urges us to engage with the experiential and relational aspects of knowledge production, especially within institutions of knowledge. While universities in India, for instance, are not only seats of knowledge production, they're also expected to be agents of social transformation. Yet, it is well known that universities can, and sometimes do, collude and align with powerful interests, thereby lending credibility to certain forms and kinds of knowledge. I spoke about it. Social authority maps onto cognitive authority. In recent times, the Rhodes Must Fall movement, which started in South Africa and then spread to the UK and elsewhere, or the decolonize movement, is an acknowledgement of the nexus between imperialism, ill-gotten wealth through slavery, loot and plunder, and knowledge production. The question is, how can somebody who engaged in slave trade, loot and plunder, and donated large amounts of wealth to university departments, is it morally, politically, and epistemically justified to base knowledge production centers on this kind of ill-gotten wealth? What kind of knowledge will such centers of knowledge production produce? Can we actually produce knowledge which is just if we do not acknowledge to ourselves, and I'm talking about the Western universities, if they do not acknowledge to themselves the history of colonial rule and slavery and plunder, which brought to the universities so many advantages and so much prosperity? Can we pretend that this did not happen? What kind of a knowledge can such a university produce? Can the knowledge productions and practices that emanate from centers of learning that are financed by such resources produce knowledge that is credible, ethical, and relevant? The processes, structures, and governance models are also very important when we talk about knowledge production. And we need to examine these very carefully. And this is precisely the theme of my latest book with my co-authors and co-editors. Non-consultative, authoritarian educational institutions cannot produce epistemic systems that are democratic. It is these concerns that I think I raise when I talk about doing feminisms in the academy. The university and the classroom has been a site of liberation, but it has also been, Shailaja Paik, in her really important and path-breaking book, shows us that the classroom, especially for students from marginalized backgrounds, Dalit and OBC communities, for instance, or ST groups, for instance, the classroom also becomes a site of intimidation, hurt, and humiliation. Thus, the same space of the university classroom evokes different emotions, attitudes, interests, and values towards knowledge. So much so that sometimes the injustices and inequalities of the university space, as experienced by Dalit students, for example, result in death by suicide, as in the case of Rohit Vemula. The contradiction between the promise and practice of education illuminates the inequalities of the broader societal location, the inequalities of caste, race, religion, gender, ability, and other kinds of hierarchies. Feminist epistemologists have argued that in some cases, the distrust across social locations is so strong. When you are in different social locations, you are just not able to trust each other, that only friendships friendships are needed to sort of bridge this gap. And sharing of knowledge is possible only when those links of social friendships and affect are created. Dalit and OBC students often complain, for example, that despite gaining entry into institutions of higher education and research, they are kept out of the exclusive circles of friendship and easy familiarity that upper caste students have with their faculty, and this results in feelings of exclusion and isolation. Feminist epistemologists frame many of these issues in terms of epistemic oppression that involves persistent epistemic exclusion. Within universities and research organizations and other academic settings, relation to other inquirers is also very crucial. The university space is hierarchically organized, and cognitive authority does flow from the top, those who are socially powerful, downwards. So very often, women and other groups that are on the margins experience erosion of their labor. They also experience humiliation, sexual exploitation, and intimidation. These are quite well known. The very controversial list of sexual harassers in the academy that was compiled by a young student of law, Raya Sarkar, in 2017 as a crowdsourced Facebook list of sexual harassers in Indian universities is a case in point. Feminist epistemology is committed to a plurality of ways of knowing and understanding, from poetry to data-driven analysis, from use of government archives to engagement with memory studies and life narratives. All these and more would be part of the feminist epistemological toolkit. Situatedness influences knowers' access to information and the terms in which they represent what they know. It bears on the form of their knowledge: articulate, diffident, formal, etc., etc. It affects their attitudes towards their beliefs. Are you certain about your beliefs? Are you a bit nervous and unsure? Are you open to dialogue? And the authority which they lay claim to their beliefs and offer them to others. The philosopher Miranda Fricker, I'm sure some of you are very familiar with her work, has argued that epistemic injustice undermines the subject specifically in their capacity as a knower, of course, but in addition, hermeneutical injustice undermines the subject in their capacity as an interpreter of their own social experience. So you don't have the confidence and the courage to interpret your own. So you lack in social self-knowledge. You are diffident. So for example, for long, women, for instance, struggle to interpret experiences of sexual harassment at the workplace, resulting in, and they suffered in isolation. The inability to interpret one's own social experiences results in grave epistemic injustice. And it was only through painstaking feminist mobilization and efforts that women began to make sense of the social experience of sexual harassment at the workplace. This revelatory knowledge brought to the feminist movement in general and to individual women in particular a special and distinctive kind of strength derived from the knowledge and ability to interpret one's own social experience. Kancha Ilaya, the well-known critic of caste-based power, talks about the strangeness of lessons that he learnt at school that were a complete variance from what he experienced within his family and community of goat herds and shepherds that he belonged to. Thus, his social experience was never validated in the certified normative knowledge imparted at school and university. To go back to where we started, the pandemic. This is a moment for the insights from feminist epistemology to be placed center stage in order to understand the impact of the virus across time and space, how different groups have been differently impacted by it, the nature of responses to the deprivations caused by the pandemic, the vaccination programs, and the rebuilding of societies and economies at the end of the pandemic. It requires collaborative, co-created knowledge that values multiple and plural approaches steeped in an acknowledgement of the hierarchical nature of societies and not an approach steeped in militaristic discourse of corona warriors who would vanquish, fight, and control the virus. Thank you. I shall stop here.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much for giving this detailed aspect of not only the theoretical understanding of what is a feminist epistemology, but also the practical issues related to that. You know, sometimes we generally see that people raise questions regarding, can you say that epistemology in itself, that is so abstract, objective, that it is biased? No, it cannot be. And I always, probably with a smirky smile, I respond to that, okay, yeah, for you it is not, but for us it has been. Okay, so that is like, the way you have narrated this whole understanding of how epistemology has been touching every core of our reality. That is very significant. I would like to thank you, from the core of our hearts, that you have cleared this difficult notion in such a lucid way that is like, very apt for all kinds of our audiences who probably do not have any specialization in philosophy. And there are so many participants, as I would like to inform you that there are 1,800 participants in this course. So some of them are here only because we have some limitations on Google Meet, but others are listening to these videos, this lecture, through live sessions. So thank you so much, ma'am. And with these words, I would like to ask Dr. Sujata, are you there?
Yes, Ritu, I'm there. Yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Sujata is the lecture coordinator of today's session. And thank you so much, Dr. Sujata, for being here with us, even though I do not feel like thanking her because she is my friend. Okay, so she is my colleague, she is my friend, and she's an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi. Her area of specialization includes environmental studies, feminism, and ethics. And she has so many things to cover in such a small introduction. So various publications and presentations, and she has been there as a part of the Gender Champion Committee of our department, and she has been very active member of our department. So whenever I ask for help, she is always ready. So even though, as I said, that she was in a very terrible situation today in the morning, and still she is here, she maintained her presence. So thank you so much, Dr. Sujata. Please give your remarks for the lecture as the lecture coordinator. Thank you so much.
It's a very difficult job, ma'am. At the very onset, I'll have to accept this, that after such an insightful lecture, it would be very difficult to give a note on what you have mentioned. This is like, shooting beyond my limits. But nevertheless, since this work, this arduous task has been given to me, I will try and just understand that what you said, and obviously reiterate few of your points which you just mentioned for the benefit of all the participants, the students here. Ma'am, you first started your lecture from epistemic arrogance to epistemic humility. I think this is exactly what you actually achieved in your lecture. From what you had, the knowledge, instead of being arrogant, you were so humble, and the way you reached out to us, it made it very interesting, very easy to comprehend, and it would benefit everybody present for the lecture. Ritu and I have been teaching this topic, and I am to say that I have learned a lot from this lecture of yours. And the best part, the lucidity of it all, is that you related it to the general examples. When we are talking about epistemic knowledge, one of the main criteria, as I feel, ma'am, you could just add to it or just suggest that one of the main criteria should also be lucidity and simple language. When we talk about objectivity of language, this all might sound very difficult to comprehend for, say, a layman. And here we are trying to talk about epistemic knowledge. We're trying to talk about social situatedness. We want to make it inclusive by bringing forth the exponential value of women also. So how do we achieve this? We can only achieve it by, reaching out to them and also trying to incorporate what they talk in their simple day-to-day language. It should not be considered as something abracadabra and, something like Dadi ka nuskha, which can be totally relegated to the background. So how you related, instead of not only making it theoretically very insightful, not only making it theoretically very comprehensive, you made it very simple for everyone to understand by relating it to these examples, to which we all owe you, because we understand it much better now. So this epidemic example that you gave, that yes, the challenges are that we need to bring to the table, we need to understand what these unequal relationships are. And instead of making it into a power dynamic structure, what we need to do is collate their experiences. It should definitely not be a combative mode, but a collateral effort, a cooperative effort to get the point of view of people, especially women also who suffered. They were an equal participant, or maybe half the workforce of people who got dislocated, displaced. So how do we go about it? Of course, it has to be a collective, cooperative, and co-produced effort. And when we say that, this semblance of knowledge, or this putting together of knowledge together, you mentioned that it is a dependent effort. It needs to be symbiotic. It should definitely not be considered pejorative or derogatory in any sense, but yes, co-produced and not in a combative mode. Not saying that one's aspect is right and the other is totally wrong, because we try to bring forth our different experiences on the table. So feminist epistemology, as you very correctly mentioned, that we need to understand it cannot be a singular approach to epistemology. And while I say this, I was also brought forth to this very important idea that we academicians also need to learn that when we are trying to struggle for our API scores and we try to gain over each other by producing single authors, I think this is a very important takeaway that I'm taking, that of course, if it is a single authorship, even when we are seeing it in a limited realm of, say, my area of specialization, which could be environmental ethics, my views could be very limited. And, if I add different perspectives, I gain a lot from, different aspects. Maybe if I'm working on an idea of Hinduism, a collated approach from Buddhism or other religion would add to my facets. It would add to more arms in my quiver. So that brings it in, that again highlights a very important point which you brought forth in such a simple way, that API scores, which we relate to. Ritu and I have gone through this process right now, so we are so well aware of this API scores. And yes, critique of individualism, again reiterating the same fact that when we talk about knowledge, it is critique of individualism, and it needs to be a collated effort. Knowledge understood, feminist epistemologies have made a very important point that it should not be just seen as a normative effort, but also a descriptive. And because we are saying it needs to be a descriptive aspect also, this obviously highlights that you need to bring their experiential value forward, and there's social situatedness. And yes, when we talk about social situatedness standpoint theory, as you just elaborated, I would not go into the detail of what Nancy Haas talks about it or Sandra Harding talks about it. But again, standpoint theory again opens the door for both not only objectivity but reflexivity. So reflexivity gives again an idea to the researchers, to the epistemologists, that you need to stand behind the frame. You need to analyze all the particularities, be it cultural particularity or the social situatedness, or how one needs to put forth the questions. Sometimes the questions in itself could be enabling or disabling. Say, when you're doing a particular research, and if you try and do a quantitative research and you move forward with your list of questions, more often than not, if the questions are, uncomfortable, people would probably not like to come forth and share the experiences, especially if the experience has been an uncomfortable one. So reflexivity along with objectivity, which is a very strong point that standpoint theory has brought forth. I think feminist epistemologists reiterate that point, that you need to reflect each and every aspect, highlight the backgrounds. And not only that, this would enable the researchers to reflect on the plurality of positions, as you just mentioned, ma'am, the plurality of positions and the multiple approaches. And that would probably make it a comprehensive, I don't know whether they can still call it holistic, but it would make it a very comprehensive study. So I'm very, very impressed with this first opening line that you have made, that from the position of arrogance, we need to abandon this power dynamic structure. From this position of arrogance, we need to, you and I are also in a position where we sometimes can fall into this trap. We are talking about feminist epistemology. Even we can fall into this trap of arrogance, that I know it and maybe a student is not as capable. So to get everybody into the sector, make people talk, contribute to the epistemological area, we need to abandon this. We also need to understand it at our end, and only then one would be, one can lecture or one can advise or one can preach that even the feminist epistemologists need to do this. So your examples of classroom where, a student is inhibited because of the experiences he or she might have had because of a disadvantaged situation, your examples of women being limited in the choices that they make about their lives and their career because of the situatedness of the washrooms. These are such real examples that I relate to, ma'am. We all struggle in our day-to-day life. And of course, this makes a very distinct contribution whether one is participative in the whole process or is not. So all in all, ma'am, I think though Ritu gave me a very difficult task, we go back from this lecture learning a lot, and we are really thankful and grateful to you to have taken our time and to share your knowledge, made it look so simple and lucid, and yet having such gainful insights into it. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sujata. And I guess, being a lecture coordinator, like always, you have done your job very nicely. So with these words, now I would like to ask Megha and Urna to take up the questions, and they will iterate those questions to ma'am, and she will respond to those questions. So Megha and Urna, who is going to go first? Urna, are you there?
I think she's doing some settings, so just let's wait, and Urna will go first with Google Meet questions.
Okay, so Urna's mic is not working, I guess. She has mentioned that. So Megha, are you going to
Hello? Sorry, Megha, am I audible now?
Yes, you are absolutely audible, and we can take Google Meet questions.
All right, great. So we'll begin. Thank you so much, Professor Menon, for this very insightful lecture. I'll proceed with the Q&A session now. So the first question is, as a woman, it is often very difficult to name one's unease in certain situations where you know that the discomfort is coming from a gendered place. And would you have any comments regarding this or advice on how to overcome this unnameability?
Hello, ma'am.
Uda, I'm not very sure actually whether I've understood the question fully, but if the question is, it's actually saying that that you sense a discomfort, but you don't know quite what it is. Yes, and I think, you know, this is something that it's not unique to or specific to women. I mean, you know, it is people on the margins of society in various ways. Say a person with disability, it could be a Black person in a largely white context, it could be a student from an Adivasi group in a classroom that is full of non-Adivasi people. So this feeling that you are somehow not fully a member of the group, and you're existing on the margins, and that you're on the outside, you're on the periphery, because your experiences are not shared by everybody else there. And that's what makes you the outsider. This is where I think standpoint really becomes a very helpful idea for us to work with, till such time that we are able to actually make sense of the reasons for our being on the margins and somebody else having more power, and we are able to draw a connection between that, and we are able to see that this is a shared experience of many others. Till that time, there's diffidence. But at a juncture when you begin to realize that you're not the only one, and it's not some random arrangement, there are many like you, and it is part of a very elaborate socio-economic structure, that's when you begin to become assertive and confident, and that's when a different kind of vocabulary emerges. I don't think from the outside it is for us to tell people, okay, so now when you feel this way, this is the name that you can give to your feeling. I think that's very presumptuous. It would have to come from the experience and engagement with that situation, the realization that there are others like you, the coming together, the understanding that this is a consequence of an elaborate and systematic organization of society which is resulting in this. So, for example, sexual harassment, you know, I spoke about Miranda Fichtner's work. If you look at her work, she begins her book with this very disturbing account actually of a office assistant in an American university back in the 1940s or 50s, where one of the very senior professors of the department actually one evening gropes her in the elevator. And not only gropes her, he forces himself on her and plants unwelcome kisses on her mouth. And she then decides to quit her job. She is so, you know, she tries avoiding him. She stops taking the elevator for a few weeks. She climbs up the stairs. Then she tries to avoid seeing him. And then she finally quits her job. When she quit her job, she asked for compensation. And one of the grounds, so you have to write the grounds on which you are asking for compensation. She had no name for the experience that she had gone through. So she actually wrote personal reasons. And because she wrote personal reasons, she got no compensation even for having quit the job. So today, of course, after the Anita Hill judgment and all in the US, I'm talking about the US, in India, for instance, after what Bhavri Devi went through in Rajasthan, we now have the vocabulary of sexual harassment at the workplace. The Vishakha guidelines happened, the law came in, there was a there are ICCs. Now we have the language. It has come from the collective struggles and experiences. So I don't think one of the things that feminist epistemology will be very cautious about is to sit and name other people's experiences and other groups' experiences. So I would hesitate to do that, Udna.
Right, thank you. The second question is, from a feminist epistemologist's perspective, can knowledge ever be objective? And if so, how does it fit with the situatedness of power? And this is in the context of the knowledge that is produced by mathematicians, physicists, etc.
Yes, I think certainly knowledge can be objective, and knowledge is, it is objective in a way in which it is mindful. So it's mindful of the subjectivities or subjective experiences from which it has emerged. It faces that origin of its knowledge squarely, bravely, and honestly, and says that from where I am located, this is how I see the world, and this. So I think that pure objectivity that, classical epistemology talks about, I don't even know whether I would want to engage with that kind of objectivity. But I think honest, within quotes, knowledge that is objective, which admits, which begins by saying, here I am, I belong to this social group, and this was my history, and this is where I am located. From where I come, this is how I see the world. So I don't think feminist epistemology is actually making a cause for only relative knowledge and everybody's subjectivities. That's a caricature of feminist epistemology. I think when feminist epistemology talks about the need to move away from objectivity, it is talking about that kind of objectivity which does not admit its own subjective origins. I think feminist epistemology is actually advocating an objectivity which is clear about the origins of both the knowledge maker and the knowledge seeker, and tries to and has a dialogic attitude towards knowledge. The word that I used, co-produce, to understand that I go to class with a certain understanding. The student brings his or her or their experiences to the classroom. In the light of those experiences, I engage with them, and we create and we make a new sense of what has been discussed. So yes, objective knowledge is certainly possible, but an objective knowledge which is mindful, aware, and transparent, that admits that this is where I am seeing the world from, and this is what it looks like. So I suppose that should answer the question.
Yes, ma'am. There's another question that's sort of related to this. How does feminist epistemology deal with the notion of generalizability in knowledge?
Well, it is generalizable, as you know. Knowledge, especially when you theorize, you are attempting to generalize. And when you generalize, that generalization is coming from diverse experiences. So I just gave the example of Bhavri Devi in Rajasthan and Anita Hill in America. Clearly, they are very different experiences, but yet I am able to also generalize. That doesn't discount the fact that Anita Hill was a Black woman, Bhavri Devi is a OBC or perhaps Dalit, I can't remember right now, from Rajasthan. Their locations are very different. And yet it is possible to bring the two together. To say that feminist epistemology is against generalizability, then you're actually taking away the possibility of feminist mobilization. Then you're actually arguing that each individual woman will have to fight her own battle. I don't think feminist politics is actually talking about that. So when you say that situatedness, you are actually confronting the fact, or you're actually admitting to the fact that each of us is put together in a frame that is provided by certain social and economic structures, social, economic, familial, cultural, sexual structures. We interact with those structures impact us, we interact with similar structures elsewhere. It is through that our locatedness is created. So there is room here for both specificity and generalizability. Like I just gave you the example of sexual harassment, when many women begin to talk about it, each of these specific experiences becomes a generalizable theory of sexual harassment at the workplace. That is not to discount the specificity of Anita Hill's experience as a Black woman. That is not to discount the experiences of a Bhavri Devi who belonged to a particular caste background in Rajasthan, performing a particular kind of work in that society. And that creates its own complexities. That is why I talked about Patricia Hill Collins's idea of intersectionality.
Thank you, ma'am. The question that I'd like to ask now is, ma'am, has feminist epistemology and its pursuit of social justice been looked at through an existentialist lens ever?
Yes, Una, I'm sure it's all, I'm not at all familiar with current work that has come out from existential philosophy on this. So I don't want to answer it with any authority. I'm not sure, but I'm sure it's just because I don't know doesn't mean it doesn't exist.
Right, of course. Then I'd like to ask, so this is a question from someone who doesn't have an academic background in philosophy. And they're asking, how important do you think it is to read theory to be a feminist?
Wait a minute. Urna, there is some disturbance from the end. So the voice is not very much clear.
Oh.
So probably you will have to turn off something. Okay. So ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. I'll do that. Just a second. Right. Is it better now, ma'am?
Yeah, it's better.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay,
better.
sorry. Yes, ma'am. So this question is from someone who doesn't have an academic background in philosophy or feminism. And they're asking, how important is it to read feminist theory in order to be a feminist?
It's not important to read feminist theory to be a feminist. Yeah. Most women who think about their lives and who are able to make these connections between their lives and other women's lives, and most men also, those who are able to make these connections and those who feel that this is unjust, they've already arrived, they are feminists. There is really no one prototype of a feminist, much as the popular press would like to caricature feminists as bal kate and smoking and hard drinking and, anti-family or whatever it is that the caricatures are. The fact is that there is no one set of prescribed qualities that a feminist has. I think to know your life, to know your, the lives of others around you, to aspire for a life that is more democratic and based on principles of fairness and justice, not only for yourself, where you realize that your life is connected with others. I think that's a feminist sensibility. The women who hugged the trees in Uttarakhand, the Chipko movement, for instance. They were women who hugged the trees not just for themselves, but for generations of people who would come after them. Many of them perhaps are no longer alive even. So I think the desire to extend yourself, to understand that justice needs to prevail not only for me, but for others around me, to be willing to take action to change that. These are essential feminist qualities. And I really don't think feminist theory precedes feminist action. Feminist theory comes out of our experiences and our actions. It's not some esoteric creature that is hanging there, resplendent, and that you will someday get. It's really a consequence of what you have gone through in life. When you try to systematize it and you try to bring a certain degree of generalizability, theory is produced. And each of us is a theorist in our own ways. So I don't have an academic background in philosophy at all, Urna, but the fact is that my own life's experiences have taught me a lot. We need to value that very much. That is really the burden of my song today. Why are we discounting our own experiences? Why are we discounting the experiences of all these 200 odd people that are here? It is out of this that feminist theory will grow, not some fruit which is, in some exotic island that you have to go and pluck and bring to Delhi or wherever it is.
That's a lovely answer, ma'am. Thank you so much. Megha will take over now with the rest of the questions.
Thank you, Urna, and thank you, ma'am, for answering the questions from Google Meet. Now I will take questions from Facebook live session, and this is the question from Pratyush. I'm also posting the question on the chat box. So here's the question, and I'm also speaking. So even the knowledge of Brahmins or any other dominant class is biased and subjective. Some problems that actually exist for many may be completely invisible to them. For an example, caste itself has become invisible, and it is common to see people saying, "Ab caste wast nahi hai kuch bhi." This might be bad for societal, political, cultural, and emotional aspects. But in epistemology, without an emotional aspect, what knowledge is to be trusted? Can any knowledge be trusted at all? So, ma'am, this is the question.
Megha, it's a very interesting set of observations, and I agree broadly with everything that's being said. I really don't see the question in it. Yes, I agree that, emotions are very important. How you feel about your classroom, how you feel about a certain teacher, how you feel about your institution, how you feel about the discipline, all of these things do impact the way knowledge that you create about that will shape up. So yes, I agree. And as for caste, that is the case with race, that is the case with so many other, hierarchies in society. Part of being privileged is the ability to not acknowledge oppression. That is really part of being privileged. When it's very common, for instance, to hear men say, "Oh, this feminism, ab ye bahut ho gaya, now everybody is equal." So it's, when you are in positions of power, one of the things that you can do is to invalidate the experience of those on the margins and those who have less power by saying, "Oh, come on now, don't rant all the time, and you're always so political." This is the way in which you dismiss any challenge that comes your way. It's a standard trick, and it's not just with reference to caste, it is with race, it is with ethnic identities. I mean, the world over, this is how power really operates.
Thank you, ma'am, for answering these questions. I think this is one of the virtues we all should have developed, that we should recognize there is kind of an inconsistencies and discriminations in our society. So the second question is from Neuher, and I will just read this question, that how does feminist epistemology propose to tackle the challenges of volume, scale, and infrastructural incapacity to be able to actually bring up the marginalized voices? So the question mainly is that because of the infrastructural limitations, how marginalized voices can be bring up to the academia maybe. So this is the question, ma'am.
Megha, I couldn't hear fully. Can you just repeat that? I heard the word infrastructure, but
yes,
the rest...
I will repeat it. The question is, due to the infrastructural limitations, how the marginalized voices can be bring up in philosophy. So can you please answer it?
What does that really mean? I don't understand. In what are, I mean, infrastructural limitations can be of?
Infrastructural limitations, ma'am. The incapacity, the limitations of volumes and scale. So this is the question.
I'm sorry, I don't quite get it, you know.
It's not that clear.
Ma'am, it's not a problem. Ma'am, we'll...
Okay, ma'am.
If you, would you like to take another question, ma'am? Otherwise, we can move on to the vote of thanks.
I think I've answered enough questions.
Oh, all right. No, of course, ma'am. Thank you so much for your time, ma'am. Right, so I shall begin with the vote of thanks now. Professor Menon, thank you so much for all your time this morning, for this truly riveting lecture. As you can see, our chat box is completely flooded with with lots of appreciation of all the points that you've raised. Our participants are quite happy today. A morning well spent. To our lecture coordinator, Dr. Sujata Roy Abhijat, thank you so much for being with us here today, ma'am, for raising many wonderful points regarding Professor Menon's statements. Lots of food for thought there. And of course, I would like to thank our wonderful course coordinator, Dr. Ritu Jaiswal, for her constant guidance and support. And the unending efforts that she put towards this lecture in particular. This lecture would have remained a pipe dream, ma'am, without your involvement. So thank you so much. I want to thank Megha, my co-moderator. I want to thank all our colleagues over at TPP for their involvement and support. And lastly, thank you so much to all our wonderful participants for remaining so engaged, so involved. We'll see you next time here at TPP. Thank you again, Professor Menon.
Just a minute.
Thank you very much.
Just a minute. Okay. Thank you so much, everyone, and thank you, ma'am. Once again, whatever your queries are, if those queries haven't been addressed here due to the paucity of time, you can always have those questions in your mind. One of the most generally asked question which I could read from the chat box is that, can a man be a feminist? Ma'am, before you leave us, please just one thing, just this one question.
Okay, so the jury is out on this, and there are two broad kinds of answers to this that's possible. One is to say that yes, of course, because feminist is, it has nothing to do with the anatomy, and in any case, we know that the anatomy itself today and has always been, I mean, who really is a woman? Is the question that this raises. In other words, it's a philosophical question. Is womanhood contingent upon hormones? Is womanhood contingent upon anatomy? Or is womanhood contingent upon certain experiences of marginalization? Or is, womanhood contingent upon chromosomal arrangements? Now, each of these questions will give us different kinds of answers to who is a woman and therefore who can be a feminist. And we also understand, we understand that womanhood itself is a dynamic conception. It keeps changing. If that's the case, those who are, sort of placed differently in the gender spectrum can certainly be feminists. There are others who feel that feminism has to be a space for those who identify themselves as women, because all other spaces are actually occupied and overwritten by the presence of the more powerful sex gender identities. It doesn't mean that men cannot be or others cannot be allies of feminism, but leave this space to women, because they really, historically, there has not been the opportunity for women to occupy a space that is solely theirs for articulation. Now, I think, it's today, with the querying of our sensibilities and understandings, it's very uncomfortable for me to say that only a woman can be a feminist. There's nothing natural about it. neither about a woman being a feminist nor about a woman for that matter. So if that's the case, I would think that feminism has to be thought of as an ever-expanding set of alliances, ever-expanding set of solidarities. And therefore, those groups in society that are committed to social justice, that are committed to egalitarian philosophy, that are committed to democracy, can certainly be part of this feminist collaborative network. So that would be my answer. I mean, I have lots of thoughts on this, but for now,
I couldn't have thought of any better answer. Okay. Thank you so much, ma'am. Even, we, when we are teaching these courses, we get these questions, these kind of questions. And it's like, very wonderful. The insight you have given, that is really, really very wonderful. So thank you so much once again, ma'am. And I would like to inform all the participants that the quiz based on the lecture will be available on the Telegram group, and you will have to pass the quiz in order to get the certificate. And once again, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.